So looking at handle submit here now, it just does way too doggone much, which makes it really hard to find out where any specific thing is going on, which makes it hard to maintain. And we've just started. So before this gets any more out of control, I kind of want to do a different thing. So what's something that we're doing repeatedly? We're creating these new spans repeatedly. That seems kind of obnoxious. So how about we create a whole new function to do those? So I'm going to make another function higher up on the page. Let's call it, what should we call it? I like to overthink my function names. What's it really doing here? It's adding one of the properties of our flick to the page. And so taking our data and adding it to the actual DOM. And this is because I'm already know React and stuff. I think of that as rendering. So that's where we take our data and we actually make it part of the UI. That's like rendering our data. So I'm going to name it renderProperty. So name, Chris name, those are properties of our flick. So I'm going to call it renderProperty. And its job is going to be to do this kind of thing. It's going to create spans and then give those spans back to us. But I want to reuse this property regardless of whether it's flick name or Chris name. I want to use the same, I want to reuse this function. So I'm just going to call this span. And the whole point is I want it to build it and give it back to us. So let's make sure we have a return value at the end here. So the question is, what information does this function need from the outside? Here we go. Const renderProperty equals function, right? What arguments is this going to need? What information does it need from the outside in order to know how to build this span correctly? Yeah. It's going to need to know what text to put inside it, right? What else does it need to know? Which other thing is going to be different depending on which span we're building? The class is going to be different, right? So what are each of those two things? So the class is really like the name of the property, right? And the text content is really the value of the property, right? So I am inclined to name those arguments name and value. So the text content is whatever the value is. And the class name is going to be not the string, not the hard-coded string name anymore, but name. Do you see what I'm getting at? Let's practice this in isolation. So this is the other nice thing about breaking it up into multiple functions, is we can test these functions on their own. Never mind how this interacts with everything else we're doing when the form is submitted. Let's just make this function do what we want. So let's try this out in the console. We can totally do that. So if I call renderProperty and I pass it in, it doesn't have to be a flick name. It doesn't have to be a name of a Chris. It can be anything. First one is name, so this is just the name of a field, right? So I could say breakfast. What'd you have for breakfast, Harrison? Breath of fresh air. Fresh air. Look at that. Gives us back a span with a class of breakfast and text content of fresh air. You get it? We're just making a little span factory here. You could call the function span factory if you want. Don't call it span factory. But do you get it? It doesn't have anything to do specifically with flick names or Chris names. It is just a thing that builds spans for us, that follows the general pattern that we were using. Yeah, Daniel? I mean, there's no, like, what kind of algorithm? I mean, data structure, maybe. Algorithm, I'm not sure what. I mean, right now we're not sorting anything. So, I mean, if you wanted to get clever, But a lot of this stuff, I mean, this is fairly efficient in the first place. But yeah, we're not doing anything. We're not worrying about putting things in a certain order or anything. We're just kind of doing things one after another at this point. So I wouldn't worry about that stuff yet. I just worry about making things work. And as far as data structures go, like we're not doing anything so complicated that we need to start worrying about like linked lists and B trees and stuff like that. But we have no structure to our data whatsoever now. We could at least throw it in a JavaScript object down the road. But again, all this stuff is actually running in the browser too, and there's not that much of it. So it's probably, it's probably efficient enough to just make these DOM elements. So yeah, I wouldn't worry about that just yet. Good question though. So do you see what renderProperty does? All it does is spit out these spans. Let's see. What were you, Eli? Were you Stegosaurus? What were you? Triceratops. No, what were you? Velociraptor. Okay. That's right. See, class dino, value Velociraptor. See what we're doing here? No big deal. So what I could do here is instead of all of this, you say const flick span equals renderProperty. And I pass in, what is it? Name is the name of this field, and the value is the flick name from the form. And maybe at this point you think that's simple enough that we don't even need to save it in a variable in between. I don't know. I don't know how you feel about that. You could totally put f.flickName.value here, and maybe that's simple enough. I don't know. How do you feel about that? I think that's reasonably clear. So we can just do the same thing with Chris over here. Say const Chris span equals renderProperty. The property name is Chris. The property value is f.chrisname.value. Still work. Got Gatu, starring Pratt. Still works. This is still on a new line, so my CSS worked too. Get it? So now that also makes it quite a bit easier to tell what handle submit is doing, because you don't have to sift through so many lines that are doing unrelated things like creating these spans and setting their text content and so on. So we're getting a little simpler here. Does that make sense? So what do we do here? Extract renderProperty function. A little refactoring. Again, we're changing the structure of our code without actually changing the way it works. Cool.